All right, so today we're diving into something pretty wild, turning CO2, the stuff everyone's trying to get rid of, into fuel.
Yeah, it's some pretty exciting stuff. It really shows how much progress is being made in sustainable energy.
For sure. We're not just talking about cutting down on emissions anymore. This is about using what we already have in a totally new way, right?
Exactly.
Like in one of these articles you sent, it talks about turning CO2 into methanol just by using sunlight,
Right.
which kind of sounds like something out of a dream. Like, how does that even work?
Well, so think of it like a tiny solar panel.
Okay.
Researchers have basically created this special material. It's got copper atoms on, get this, nanocrystalline carbon nitride. And when sunlight hits this, it sets off this whole chain reaction and boom, CO2 and water are turned into methanol, which of course can be used as fuel.
So we're talking capturing sunlight and CO2,
Yeah.
two birds, one stone kind of thing.
Exactly.
But is it actually efficient enough? I mean, could this actually be a real solution?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, the research shows there's huge potential here, but like the article said, they're still working on the efficiency and selectivity of it all. Those are the big challenges right now.
Okay, so we've talked methanol, but this other article jumps right to jet fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And it mentions this organic combustion synthesized FMNK catalyst, which sounds honestly a little intimidating.
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
Well, it's actually a lot simpler than the name makes it sound.
Okay.
Basically, this catalyst is made from, iron, manganese, and potassium.
Okay.
And what's really cool is that it can take CO2 and turn it into those long-chain hydrocarbons that are used in jet fuel. And it does all this using renewable electricity and steam.
Hold on. So you're saying we could power airplanes with fuel made from captured CO2?
Yeah.
That's a game changer, especially for, the whole carbon footprint of aviation.
Exactly. That's what's so exciting about this. This research is all about directly converting CO2 to fuel, which is way more efficient and environmentally friendly than the indirect methods.
Okay, so both these articles mention how CO2 is so stable.
Right.
Like it's really hard to wrangle and work with. So how are scientists even dealing with that hurdle?
Yeah, you're right. CO2 is notoriously unreactive. And that's exactly why catalysts are such a big deal in these processes. Think of them like the middleman, They make it easier for these reactions to happen and they speed things up a lot. It's just really hard to find the right catalyst for the job.
So finding the right catalyst is the tricky part, right?
Yeah.
But what makes it so hard to find? Is it like a cost thing or is it something else?
Well, it's kind of a lot of things all at once.
Okay.
Like you need to find a catalyst that not only works, but it has to be really good at its job. Converting a lot of CO2. And it's got to be picky, too. We only want it making the fuel, not a bunch of other stuff we don't need.
Right. Makes sense.
And then on top of all that, of course, it's got to be affordable. Otherwise, it's never going to work in the real world.
Totally. So this jet fuel article, it mentioned there are two ways to go about this.
Yeah.
Direct and indirect conversion. And you were saying how that direct conversion is like taking the highway. It's more efficient.
Right.
And that would mean like cheaper jet fuel, which, hey, maybe cheaper plane tickets for us, right?
Yeah.
So why even bother with the indirect route then? What's the point of that?
You're right. Direct conversion is really appealing, but going the indirect route, like through CO or methanol, it gives you something really valuable: control.
Okay.
It's like with indirect conversion, you can fine-tune the fuel. So
Well.
you can adjust it depending on, what you're using it for, like picking the right tool for the job.
Oh, okay. So it's about having options, I guess.
Okay.
And speaking of the right tool, the articles talked about how jet fuel needs that very specific carbon chain length.
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
That's a great question. Basically, it all comes down to how well the fuel burns. The length of those carbon chains affects everything: how much energy it has, how stable it is, even how it ignites. And for jet fuel, you need a chain that's just right, usually between 8 and 16 carbon atoms. That's what works best for those aircraft engines.
So it's like, I don't know, using lighter fluid versus trying to burn a log or something.
Exactly.
You need the right stuff for the job. It's amazing, though, that they can actually control those carbon chains on such a tiny level.
Mm-hmm.
But both of the articles mentioned how efficiency is still a big problem. What are, the bottlenecks they're running into, and how are they trying to fix them?
Yeah, it's true. Efficiency is still a major focus.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest challenges is coming up with those super active and selective catalysts we were talking about. They need something that can turn as much CO2 as possible into the fuel we want without making a ton of byproducts. It all comes down to the design, like what the catalyst is made of and how it's structured. So researchers, they're always experimenting, trying to find that perfect recipe, to make these catalysts work even better.
Oh, I see. So it's like finding the perfect recipe for a cake or something. You got to get the ingredients just right.
Exactly.
But besides these catalysts, what are some of the other roadblocks they're facing in, actually making this commercially viable? Like, how do we take this from the lab to the real world?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I mean, it's not just about the science, right?
Right.
We have to figure out the engineering, the economics of it all. It's one thing to make it work in a lab, but to scale it up,
Right.
to actually produce enough fuel to make a difference,
Yeah.
that's a whole other challenge. We need to design reactors, figure out how to manage the heat,
Yeah.
even make sure we have enough raw materials, and then there's the cost.
Yeah, of course.
If it's too expensive, no one's going to switch over from the fossil fuels we're using now, right?
Right. It's a huge task, but the payoff could be massive. And speaking of massive, one of the articles mentioned something called organic combustion synthesis.
Yeah.
Something to do with the catalyst, right?
Yes.
And honestly, it seems kind of counterintuitive. Like you're using combustion to create something that's supposed to lead to cleaner fuels.
Yeah, it does seem a bit strange, doesn't it?
It does.
But that's what's so cool about it. Instead of using, harsh chemicals or super high temperatures, they're using a much more controlled burn to create the catalyst.
So it's like fighting fire with fire.
In a way, yeah.
It's pretty wild. So what's the advantage of doing it that way?
Well, it's all about sustainability right from the start.
'Kay.
See, this method, it uses the combustion of organic materials to actually make the catalyst.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you're making the production of the catalyst itself more sustainable.
Gotcha. So we're potentially talking about like a complete revolution here.
Yeah.
How we power everything from our cars to airplanes. So where are we with all of this? Like, are we really on the edge of this green fuel revolution?
I think that while these advancements are super promising, we need to be realistic about the timeline.
Okay.
The science is moving fast, but like we talked about, there are those practical challenges to actually making it happen on a large scale.
Right. It's not just about the science.
Exactly.
So for people who are, following this research, what should they be paying attention to? What's like the next big question?
Keep your eye on those catalysts, how efficient we can make them, how we're going to produce them sustainably. And on a large scale, that's what's going to determine if all this can actually become a reality. But honestly, I think there's an even bigger question we need to ask.
Okay, what's that?
How does all of this fit into the bigger picture of, our energy infrastructure?
That's a good question.
Like, can we just plug these new fuels into our current system, or are we going to have to start from scratch?
Yeah. It's a whole new world of possibilities, isn't it? And it's, like you said, it's not just about the science anymore. It's about completely changing how we think about energy in the first place. Well, this has been a fascinating look into turning CO2 into fuel. From capturing sunlight to building these tiny carbon chains, it's amazing to see what they're doing out there. And honestly, it gives me hope for a cleaner, more sustainable future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.